Saturn forces combined with other planetary forces. But as indicated in the Saturn forces, violent changes come in the experience by influences or activities from the Martian, or madness, or wrath, or those activities that produce sudden changes. Yet, as is seen in the Uranian experiences, there are good and bad. When good, it is very, very good. When the adverse influence comes from Saturn and Mars, it makes for very racking mental experiences of the entity and the activities. In Saturn we find changes do and will come. These are not necessarily, however, in the way of the extremes. Yet Uranus being the greater or stronger influence in the experience of the entity, there may come extreme changes, but they will come rather from the associations or activities with others than through the efforts or the shortcomings of self. Hence there needs be that there be the greater dependence upon self and self's abilities, self's assurance, not only in the material sense, but in the abilities to think, the abilities to apply spiritual attributes in its relationships to others. This is one of those influences the entity should learn the more. For in those things as make for the mental ability and the influences with the masses, do we find the greater influence, as in Jupiter, and the changes as come in Saturn, and the extremes in Uranus. And if these are balanced in the love of God for his love to thee, and that which ye may show in thy dealings with thy fellowmen, these as purposes and ideals, and not as things merely to be seen or witnessed by others, built in thy experience, there will be brought a purpose, an outlook, a desire, a hope that will take away from the experience of the entity much of the doubt and fear which has so oft existed. For know, as ye sow, so shall ye reap, as is indicated by that being reaped in the present from the experience before this. In the Uranian aspects we find the extremes, as have been, as are. And when these are in conjunction with Saturn forces, the changes have been wrought so quickly that oft these no doubt have become confusing. But there is ever the answer, as ye abide in me, I abide in thee. The less and less of self, then, the more and more of thy will, not mine, be done in me and through me, the greater becomes the abilities, the greater becomes the harmonies, the greater joy there is seen in the experiencing of associations and activities with others, and life becomes not a bed of flowers or roses, but worthwhile. Things and conditions and experiences become a part of the entity's activities. In Saturn we find changes that may be very much according to the aptitudes from the Uranian forces. For, much of material benefits will be a part of the entity's experience. Let this not spoil the entity in its formative years, in disregarding values of every nature in its experience. Most everyone who meets or is acquainted with the entity, because of these very influences, will wield an influence, and will want to give to the entity. Thus, none need ever fear as to the material benefits for the entity, but there will need to be the directing as to the evaluations of such in its experience, in its formative years. There will be great attractions for the entity to the opposite sex. Hence there would be the warning that there be not an early marriage for the entity, for this would bring the Saturn, as well as the Uranian influences in those activities through the Venus forces, which will occur in the experience through its 17th to 18th year of experience in this sojourn. In Saturn we find the variations and the divisions that have arisen in the experience of the entity from period to period, as well as the activities in the present sojourn. And these have not always been physically as a pleasure. But the application of self through those influences from the Uranian sojourn has made a cosmic consciousness of growth. Astrologically we find Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Uranus the ruling forces and influences. Though Saturn is not a beneficent influence, it is not an influence for the changes as sometimes, or the more often, indicated through activities or sojourns there. Also there are periods when Saturn is adverse to both Mercury and Venus, and at such periods, there are the inclinations for the entity to condemn or belittle self and self's abilities. Train the mental self to become aware of the divine within, and not belittle self, but rather glorify that divinity within self in every way and manner. And those influences in Saturn with Jupiter, as we find, these have been made for. Will make for. Those periods when the entity has those urges as of constantly renewing or beginning over, whether in relationships with individuals, circumstances, associations, activities or what. These are as innate, and as to what the entity does about or with such experiences or such urges, makes for developments or retardments in the present experience. In Saturn we find those differences, those sudden changes, those tendencies towards the physical weaknesses that arise. Yet, if the Uranian forces are made more manifest, though they indicate themselves in the extremes to which the entity's experiences arise at times, these may be overcome. Let not the extremes be Saturn bent, then, but rather as the true Uranian influence, the interest in the manifested application of creative forces, spirit, mind, not matter, not those things that make afraid. For, with those abilities indicated more than once in the directing forces of Venus, there comes those innate abilities for the better self to give expression. No, there are hidden forces, latent within self, not aroused to their best ability, their best activity. In the spirit of truth, as manifested in him who is the way, the truth, the life, may those activities be aroused. For, no, with surrounding thyself with the consciousness of the Christ force, no intent, no purpose of any force may contend with that spirit. Those influences from Saturn make for a period of weighing and testing, and the body feels in self that the last few years have certainly been a testing in self, as to that injunction which has been set before man, there is today set before thee good and evil. Choose thou. This tempered, however, with those sojourns in that influence or environ in Venus, makes for that temperament of being oft easily swayed from those things that would hinder in the experience of the entity. Yet that balance must be kept within self, that the swaying is not carried to the other extreme. For, even in the affairs in self's experience, this is found in the experience of the entity in the present, that he is oft called an extremist, whether in activities that have to do with the associations in the activities of the body and the relationships in the home, in the love life, or in that relationship that must exist between self and others. These are as the reflections, then, of these influences in the experience, through the sojourns in those influences. In Venus, Mercury, Mars, we find urges that are at times a part of the experience, adversely at times in Saturn, that influence through which all insufficient matter passes that may be spiritualized, or that influence to which an entity is attracted in those periods of sojourn in the earth. As indicated in Saturn, changes come. Make the best of them. Do not mope over the sorrows or the changes, but use these as opportunities to speak well of those you don't like very much. Never give expression to the thought that you hate this or that body, but rather that you dislike some of the wares they present of their personalities. Then, see the best in everyone. Those signs that have been set that say stop, the other side reads go. Turn it over. So, in all the problems that may arise, view them from the various angles. In giving those urges latent and manifested from the astrological sojourn, or awarenesses of the entity in other dimensions of consciousness than the earth, we find that there should be the consideration that in the earth we have 3 dimensions, in Mercury 2 dimensions, in Venus 4 dimensions, in Jupiter 7 dimensions, in Saturn 1 dimension, in Uranus 8 dimensions. These are, then, urges. Thus confusions at times. Yet the entity is ever as a play actor to itself, and too oft this is evidenced in the experience with others. Thus not always is the entity taken seriously. Mercury is mind, or the awareness of that consciousness. Venus indicates beauty, activity, dependent upon whether this is acted upon by the material, mental or spiritual purposes. For these enter, as indicated, the 4th dimension of consciousness. Thus beauty as it is possessed in self, in body, in mind, in soul. Don't abuse it. Remember and know as the law, that what is thine no one can take from you, but you can throw it away, waste it, lose it by lack of appreciation, lack of use, by abuse and such. Also from Venus ye find thy abilities as an actress, as a songwriter, as a dancer, as in principles that may be applied to everything having to do with beauty. Use these abilities, don't abuse them. Saturn makes for the tendencies for the entity to change this or that association, this or that environment, before there has been, often, the possibility even for the culmination of the activities from the influences set in motion. Yet these having recently passed in the experience of the entity should, in the next 3.5 to 4 years, make the opportunities for the peak of the entity's development during this experience. For Jupiter soon comes into a benevolent influence in the experiences of those who have sojourned in the influence of this developing influence in the experience of this soul, this entity, activative in the experiences of 815. In this we find conflicting influences also, through those periods of the sojourn in Saturn, that changeable influence, that environ to which all insufficient matter in earth is cast, that environ which is soon to rule in the experience of the entity. And if it were not for those benevolent influences in Jupiter, we find, it would bring those periods of depression that would weigh heavily upon the entity's urge, as respecting some friendships, in which a great deal of confidence and faith has been put as a friend. Yet, as we find from these sojourns, they will be rather as those experiences which, if they are used in the proper way and directions, may become as stepping stones to a greater understanding. Oh, that all would learn those lessons that, though there may be the periods of trial, temptation, when all the experiences seem fraught with disappointments in the associations, the love influence, the confidences that have been placed in him, we may find that which will be rather as the necessity of experience that the real self may grow in understanding, in knowing how others may view us. Yet without judging their motives, without judging their purposes, we may gain that which is helpful, and these experiences become stepping stones for the larger life. In Saturn we have those that make for the changes in environs, the changes in the thought, in the mental attitudes of the entity, yet these, if they are weighed well in the mental ability, in the gentleness of spirit, in the breadth of vision, may make forever that ennobling influence as to direct the entity in its greater activity. These are, then, as the ruling astrological or spiritual sojourns of the entity in this present experience, making for one, while often changing in its attitude of approach to individuals, to groups, to classes or to the activity of self as in relationship to all, with a gentleness of purpose that shows consideration. Jupiter makes for a seeking, a breadth of vision in many fields of activity, in those that delve into the inmost expressions of mass, group or individual. Yet these have been at an adverse influence in the experience, for Saturn having also an expression in the entities sojourning there has made for many changes or many influences that make for hindrances to the greater abilities of the entity in the seeking in those directions. Yet these should, in the coming months and year, show for a more benevolent activity. Saturn and the will and ideals. In Saturn we find that influence of an ever-changing nature, of a seeking, of a renewing, of making starts. And this must be tempered, ever, with that which answers from within, that the choice made, the chosen path, the way in which that sought must be accomplished, is in keeping with that ideal that is held, is set before self. Under Saturn we may find many adverse conditions and many changes ever in the offing or the making. These depend not upon that which is a force, but rather an influence existent because of the way the will has been applied by the entity in the past. The will of the entity is that gift of the creator, or that portion which makes it an entity, an individual, with the ability to know itself to be itself yet one with that desired whether knowledge or truth or good, or bad or evil or what. For there is ever set before each soul, and body and spirit, or mind, body, soul, good and evil, life and death, will being that factor, the choice, the birthright to every individual as man, or who is attained to the separations, as to become so individualized which in the application makes for developments or retardments. In those influences from Saturn we find off the sudden changes in environs, whether mental, material or even spiritual experiences, and the continual experience of the entity determining within self to right about face in this or that activity, in this or that environ, in this or that influence that has become or becomes a part of the experience. What is, then, thy ideal? For truth, while a growth, is indeed ever the same, and is the stepping stone to material, mental and spiritual success. Also from Saturn we find the inclinations for seeking new fields, whether these be for material experiences, a mental emotion, or the seeking for things because they are new or strange. These become a part of the experience. Then, temper all of these with that thou would set as thy ideal, and ye will find these may be turned from many of the hardships that have been thine even in the present, to those experiences where life and its joys and sorrows becomes a real experience, yes, worthy of making the most of same under every circumstance. Look upon it as thy opportunity to be a channel of blessings to someone, not for thy glory, but for the glory of him who gives thee life, in whom ye live and move and have thy being. For he will take thee up when others desert thee. He will comfort and cheer thee when life and its surroundings appear the darkest. Look then to him. For he is thy rock, he is thy haven of rest, and ye shall find that peace as he has given. Not as the world knoweth peace but as they alone who walk and talk oft with their God. That those influences from astrological aspects are arising as urges is true. Not because of the position of a star or planet or any sign of the zodiac, but rather because of what one has done about what each of those planets or environs represents in the existence, in the consciousness of the individual entity, as related to the whole of the creative force in the entity's experience. How has it been given? Where the heart is, or where the treasure is, there the heart is also. What is thy treasure? Then ye know the purpose, the seeking. To put it in another manner. Do ye know thy ideal, mental, spiritual, material? They may be as far apart as the east is from the west, but are they real? For in the very nature of thyself as from the astrological aspects, in Saturn, ye find this innate. Ye think one manner, ye oft give expressions in the hearing of others that are not altogether in keeping with that ye really think. Not that it is the intent to be double-minded or two-faced, but rather thy means, thy manner of drawing from others their expressions, their ideas. In Saturn we will find the changes, the seeking of many different fields and ways and manners of giving expression to self. For as those temperaments, as those extremes manifest, so will those inclinations for pessimism. Hence the great need of being grounded in an ideal that is beyond reproach, that is not made with hands, nor with monies nor with fame, but rather that city whose foundation and maker is God. In Saturn we find the changes of every nature, in thought, in manner, in mien, in associations and in activities that have come about. Yet the entity from its very nature is very strong-willed, and oft when persuaded to do different from that which the inner promptings would direct the entity hates himself for it. Then, look within self. Know in whom as well as in what ye believe. Set an ideal, as to citizenship, as to parenthood, as to neighbor, as to manner of church service, as to manner of neighborly activity, as to thy spiritual, thy mental self. And then so live thine own life in those relationships that others would never question as to what thy ideal is. Not then as a demanding but as a commanding entity, soul, personality. And let thy personality be so imbued with the divine individuality of self that no question is ever asked as to whether ye walk and talk with thy God, nor as to who is thy Lord and Master. For remember, what ye are, what ye do, speak so loud that seldom is what ye say heard or heeded. From the Saturn forces, as indicated, we find the changes that have been wrought and that become sudden at times. Yet we find the indications that there will be periods in the present sojourn when a great deal of material affluence and influence are a part of the experience. Use these in manners as would be for the instruction of others into those directions that are not merely idealistic but practical everyday ideals for individuals, as well as for self. From the influences in Saturn we find the definite changes. And sometimes extremes, as also indicated in the periods when there is not the benevolent influence in Jupiter. Hence we find the entity in the present is often in that position of wondering as to which or what course to pursue. As has been indicated, do not be afraid of giving self in a service, if the ideal is correct. If it is for selfish motives, for aggrandizement, for obtaining a whole to be used in an underhand manner, beware. If it is that the glory of truth may be made manifest, spend it all, whether self, mind, body, or the worldly means, whether in labor or in the coin of the realm. From the changing influences or activities indicated in Saturn, we find that aspect which has been determined, but, as is understood, none of these have a greater influence than that which is the birthright of each soul. Choice as to what one may do about the urges that arise, whether they be those innate or mental or emotional, the emotional more often arising from material sojourns in the earth. While the sojourns in the earth that influence in the immediate have not been a great many, we find that a great many have influenced the entity which are now past, so far as their application in the individual or present experience is concerned. Hence we find the entity's abilities in many directions, yet inclined oft to change, for the Saturn forces becoming in conjunction with Venus, as combined with the Uranian, we find the extremes and the changes that are oft of such extreme natures as to become confusing. One of the influences that must first be builded, then, is to first know thy ideals, spiritually, mentally, materially. And in the spiritual, know that the ideal must be that which is able to keep whatever may be committed unto it against any experience. In the mental, it must be ever constructive, creative in its influence, in its activity. In the material it must be not what you would want others to do for you, but the ideal manner and way in which ye must meet those influences, those associations, those affiliations with thy fellowmen. For, inasmuch, and in the manner as ye do unto the least of thy brethren, ye do unto thy Maker. These as we find should be studied, analyzed, thought through, and, no matter what the cost may be, they should be lived up to, in accordance with that ideal. And we will find that it will bring harmony, contentment, and sufficient of every worldly, spiritual, material thing necessary for thy soul development. Then, what thy destiny is depends upon what ye will do with thyself in relationship to thy ideal. These become problems within self, as is indicated also through the material sojourns that have made, and do make for problems, as well as virtues, in thy daily experience. Know that it is not all just to live, not all just to be good, but good for something, that ye may fulfill that purpose for which ye have entered this experience. And that purpose is that you might know yourself to be yourself, and yet one with the creative forces, or God. Then, study to show thyself approved unto thy ideal. What, then, is thy ideal? You find yourself a body, a mind, a soul, each with its attributes, manifesting in a material world. And you realize that the body, the mind and the soul are one, and that confusion may cause detrimental influences to body, to mind or to soul. Then, you must have your ideal as to spiritual values, as to spiritual imports in your experience. And know, whatever may be your desire, it must have its inception in spiritual attitudes. What, then, is your spiritual ideal? In your mental body you find at times confusion, as indicated. But what is your mental ideal? One willing to pay the price in study, in application, that you may gain the proper concept not only of your relationships to spiritual forces from within and without, but your relationships with your fellow man in every phase of your experience. In Saturn we find the very sudden changes, and these as combined with extremes at times become very disturbing forces, or make for same, unless the criterions of the influences are well set as to the ideals. These cultivate. Know that the ideal of the physical relationships is not what others may do, so oft, as what ye must do for others, not belittling nor judging, nor condemning self or others. For, let thy ideal be in that, as ye would that others should do to you, do ye even so to them. Those influences innate and manifested in Saturn make for disappointments that have been both material and personal in the experiences of the entity. In the present there have been those periods when the disappointments in individuals' activities have been most crushing. Yet there has arisen oft from these, dependent upon the application of will as respecting that is the entity's ideal, as compared with the standard of creative forces, those conditions which made for stepping stones, or those that made for retardments, either in the present or for those experiences to come. In the application of will respecting the experiences that make for the abilities in the present, with those experiences that have been had by the entity in and through the Earth's plane, combined with the experiences, training, knowledge, understanding in the present. That, as indicated, of controlling rather through the suggestive training methods of individuals' ideas and abilities in expressions of selves in that they, as individuals, would attempt to convey to others as to their particular standing or directing in their individual experience. Would the ability of controlling or urging through the impulse of that thought, that training be in those spheres wherein the activities of the individual were compelled by the impelling forces of creative energy, rather than of self's individuality to become personality, there will be a much more contentment and satisfying results in the experience of the endeavors and activities of the entity. In the likes and dislikes that are builded in the entity, that as some would call show. Yet to the entity rather is it the experience of self, as combined with the efforts of others to express themselves in terms of their own concepts of things or circumstance, or conditions. This brings also those likes as respecting the arts, as applied to the higher expressions of ideas, and sometimes ideals, in the experience of others, also those desires to travel, those desires to see the various circumstances under which the peoples and conditions act one upon another. However, with those influences of Saturn so oft entering, we find that even though there are the abilities for a long mental mind, there is the forgetfulness of names or faces. Also from Saturn, as combined with urges from material sojourns, as will be seen, there are the tendencies for sudden and unexpected changes, as if directed in such change by unseen, unexpected sources. Know that he, thy ideal, hath need of thee. Thus the greater injunction would be to quit thyself as one who may be worthy to be entrusted with the directing of thy fellow men, in those things as bring harmony and peace in the material world, assurance and peace in the spiritual realm, that may bring safety in the activity with others, as may be prompted from thy interpretation in word, and more indeed of the law of truth in dealing with thy fellow men. Saturn is as an intercepting influence at times, and, as the entity should understand, no urge, no influence exceeds the will of the entity itself, which is activative through the body, mind and soul. For, all of these influences are one. The entity finds itself in a three-dimensional plane of consciousness in the earth, that in the earth as mind, that in the universe as the Godhead, that in the spiritual realm as the influence of all as one. Yet each influence, each phase has its part in the experiences of the entity, thus requiring judgments by the will as to that selected or chosen as the channel of activity for that particular phase of experience. Analyze self oft, then. For, know that ye are part of the controlling influence of the universe. Thus, that indicated through astrology is the use to which the entity, through its sojourns in the earth, has put that accredited to the consciousnesses in which he as an entity have vibrated or manifested. Many influences enter in the experience of this entity, more from activities in the material plane than from what might be ordinarily termed the astrological sojourns. While the sojourns of the entity and those consciousnesses we term the astrological aspects do have their influence, these are manifested more in the manner or way of thinking, as indicated in Mercury, Venus, Jupiter and Saturn. These, then, bring the high mental abilities, the interest in music, art, and the universal consciousness, also the affliction in Saturn. Thus the desire of change in the activities. Thus the necessity, as in most entities, that patience be practiced, not only as a theory, but as a reality in the experience, not only patience with things, conditions that are a part of the experience, but with people, with others, with time, with influences that may alter the activities of the entity. As to the appearances, the entity puts a stress upon karma. Thus, as may be the experience, if ye live by law you must judge by law. If ye live by faith, ye judge by faith. If ye live by grace, ye must practice grace and be gracious. If ye would have friends, ye must show yourself friendly. If ye would have patience, ye must be patient first with self, and then with others. These, then, the appearances, have been quite varied, for the entity is an Atlantean and a Saturn Atlantean, using knowledge in that experience to its own confusion. The entity seeks knowledge of every form or manner, and it is well, but to know to do and not to do it is sin. And thus, as you use that in hand is more given thee. For, life itself is the manifestation of that creative force or influence ye would call God. Study, then, to show thyself approved unto an ideal. What is an ideal? This ye must first determine in thine self. In the astrological urges we find the high mental abilities, the universal consciousness, and in Saturn those weaknesses of appetites, those tendencies to use the power or position for gratifying its own ego or self. These should be lost the more in that universal consciousness of the whole. Then, it would be well if the entity itself would choose its own ideals, spiritual, mental and material, and make application of same, first finding self. Saturn brings sudden changes. Yet as indicated in Mercury, if the judgments of the spiritual and mental self are attained and kept as ideals, not ideas alone but ideals, we find that the changes that may be experienced by the entity may ever be used as stepping stones and not stumbling blocks. Be patient with self first, then with others. For in the use of thy abilities in the urges from Venus, as well as Saturn, ye may control those about thee or those whom ye would attract to thee as thy friends, as thy associates in thy activities. In the urges, then. Find first what is thine own ideal spiritually, mentally, materially. Let the ideals of the material life, of which ye become so conscious at times, be the outcome of the application of self, and not as that to be attained whether or no. Know in what and in whom ye believe. Then thy abilities to control, thy abilities to attract, thy abilities to contribute to the mental, spiritual and material welfare of others, of thy associates, of thy companions, thy friends, thy community, will be in the purposes of thy ideal, and not in the purposes of the self alone. Keep true to self, and ye will not be false to any. In thy abilities in the mental capacities changes have been wrought as in Saturn. Changes are wrought in management, changes are wrought by death, changes are wrought by the variedness as to who is to be head. And you've been put out by many of these. Don't let it bring anger to thee. But begin in the beginning. Find thy ideal spiritually. This isn't preaching. This isn't giving just a good policy. This is obeying the law of man and the law of God. And these coordinated will make a success out of even an ass. Then, do make thyself coordinate with the laws of God, with the laws of nature, with the laws of man, and ye will find that thy abilities will mean much. From the sojourns in those consciousnesses and realms or dimensions other than in the earth, we find urges arising from Saturn, Mercury, Venus and Jupiter. Then, these all become afflicted by changes wrought in thy experiences and associations in material things. Saturn is that realm to which all insufficient matter is cast for remolding. This rules the entity mostly. But know that no urge of any soul exceeds the will of self, that which makes you as an individual different from all other individuals. For no one can touch the soul nor add to nor take from it, other than by thy will allowing such to be done. Then in Mercury we find the high mental abilities. Do not confuse knowledge with understanding. In Venus we find love. Do not confuse affection with love. Do not confuse passion with love. Love is of God, it is creative, it is all-giving. What should be the result if God manifested force in thee and not the expression of patience, not the expression alone of beauty that is gratification, but a fulfilling of a longing, a hope that is latent and deep within each soul. We find in Jupiter and Saturn the urges such that the entity should be warned not to let thine honor bend duty to this, or that deter thee from those things that are as responses in thine own soul. Thus is the character of this particular entity. Thus are the problems ye face in thy mental and material self. All the more reason, then, for the entity first analyzing self. Know self. Know what ye believe spiritually, mentally. Know who is the authority spiritually for the thought, the idea, and who is the author of thy ideal. Then ye may be sure that as the purpose and desire is set in motion, the material expression will be in keeping with that which will ever be creative in thy experience, and in those fields of service, where ye may contribute to the welfare of the physical and mental well-being. For when man has learned that the physician must be the physician to the soul as well as to the body, he will have begun to find the meaning that the great physician gave to his ministry in the earth. As he indicated, which is it easier to say, son, thy sins be forgiven thee, or rise, take up thy bed and walk. Learn the meaning of such. Use that thou knowest today in the way and manner that will build for that which answers the motivating force within self, not unto self-glorification, but for that thou settest before thyself as thine ideal. For in a spiritual ideal one may conquer the earth, the mental world, the masses even, but one that sets its ideal in an individual, or that which is of the earth earthy, may be finding self stumbling over that it has set as its idea or ideal. For, as he has given, if ye will abide in that I have given thee, I will come and abide with thee and give thee that necessary for not only thine speech, but thine activity, thine purpose, thine desire in the earth. For if we would attain to that which is of the soul, for its own development, we will follow in those precepts that he, thine Savior, thine ideal, has set before thee. From Saturn we find the tendency for the starting of new experiences, the starting of new associations in the activities, and unless these are tempered with the mental influences, they are rarely carried to their full termination. This again would be as a warning to the entity. When thou hast chosen that direction, that activity thou would take, know that thou art kept in a balance that is of the material, mental and spiritual influences near to right. Then lay it not aside until it, the activity, has borne fruit in thy mental and material experience. These, as we see, are the innate influences. As to what the entity in the present will do concerning these things in the experience depends upon self's own application of will. For, as has oft been given, there is set before thee that which may be good or evil. Choose thou. The abilities lie before thee to make a mental, material and, above all spiritual success in the present experience. Choose thou. In Saturn we find that of a finishing, or determinations without being hard-headed. In most individuals such experiences make for determinations such as classifying them among those that are hard-headed or determined without the thought or consideration of others. Yet, in this entity's experience, being tempered with Jupiter and Mercury, the determination is rather balanced by circumstance, yet never losing sight of the idea or ideal, and weighed well with judgment. Other general ideas about astrological forces. In what way may the entity be of assistance in the work of the Association of National Investigators Incorporated? Just given. In what specific capacity? Just given. Become the astrologer for the association's membership. Giving to these the weeks, the years, and that influences without respect of will, or an interpreter with same of that information, as to how an individual has or has not applied will's forces in the earth's experience. Also the relationship of the sojourn in the various elements that have to do with the spheres as related to Earth's sphere, the variations from one passing through Arcturus to other forces, or returning to Saturn. In Saturn we find the great changes in the entity's experience. The entity will move almost in a double cycle, or it is not satisfied to be staying in any place more than 3.5 years, and that would be too long for the entity. This is very well, yet the entity has the ability to become whatever it may choose and to direct or control large enterprises. Nothing would suit the entity better than being an overseer for a large plantation, and yet it would not be possible for the entity ever to be satisfied except in a city or in large crowds or where it can be just as lonesome as it chooses or have just as much of the close environs as it desires. For the entity desires oft to be in crowds and then to just be let alone, for it can enjoy itself analyzing people. For it does, irrespective of what may be the activities. The entity may have a career as well as a home, and this very few women may do, but they will be entirely different. The entity may live one experience in the home and then conduct the affairs of a corporation or organization, or of a state or county or of a nation, and it'll be left at its office when it leaves same. Few can accomplish such. This does not mean to indicate that the entity is double-minded, but it is able to become mental-minded, spiritual-minded or material-minded, and to keep them separate. These are the abilities, then, of the entity, and these are the activities through which the entity may find the outlets for itself, a home and a career. Neither one alone would satisfy the entity. What incarnations have I had other than those given in my life between the Egyptian period 10,500 BC and the present? Those as have been given in the Earth's plane are of the Earth that made for either development or retarding of. Others, the entity, as an entity, has entered the Earth's plane only for a period of presenting self through the plane to enter, and some other, as of Venus, Jupiter, Uranus, here the entity has entered, but as to keeping in the solar forces of this particular solar force or system, the Earth enters as an interchange, as does Saturn, for that of an Earth's remolding. These may be given from other directions or channels, as would be indicated by both the astrological and the numerological influence. We find for this body, then, Uranus, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus and Mars all become a part of the entity's inner consciousness. Thus we find one who may easily become very emotional over any experience, or may easily become very disappointed or subjugated by material or mental conditions. These, then, are the warnings. Turn more to the soul self, the spiritual man. And then is the spirit directing, and with what spirit you entertain, or with what spirit ye give power to that attempted. Naturally, in Uranus we find the interest in the occult, the unusual, the educational factors, or any form of activity. In Mars and in Saturn we find political tendencies. For the entity, while not being a figure observed in the material, may be the power behind any political faction. These then lend power, as it were, possibilities, probabilities in the experience of the entity, dependent upon how and why these urges are applied in the dealings with the fellow man. Does the soul choose the planet to which it goes after each incarnation? If not, what force does? In the creation, we find all force relative one with the other, and in the Earth's plane that of the flesh. In the developing from plane to plane becomes the ramification, or the condition of the will merited in its existence finding itself through eons of time. In the illustration, or manifestation in this, we find again in the man called Jesus. When the soul reached that development in which it reached Earth's plane, it became in the flesh the model, as it had reached through the developments in those spheres, or planets, known in Earth's plane, obtaining then one in all. As in Mercury pertaining of mind. In Mars of madness. In Earth as of flesh. In Venus as love. In Jupiter as strength. In Saturn as the beginning of earthly woes, that to which all insufficient matter is cast for the beginning. In that of Uranus as of the psychic. In that of Neptune as of mystic. In Septimus as of consciousness. In Arcturus as of the developing. As to various constellations and of groups, only these ramifications of the various existences experienced in the various conditions. Explain and illustrate, in the spheres of many of the planets, within the same solar system, we find they are banished to certain conditions in the developing about the sphere from which they pass, and again, and again, and again return from one to another, until they are prepared to meet the everlasting creator of our entire universe, of which our system is only a small part. In this condition, we find much as is given in relativity of force. In this, again we find in this, the entity entering the Earth's plane and manifesting in the flesh, when such conditions are shown in the body, that the spiritual entity is banished unto Saturn, that condition in the Earth's solar system to which all insufficient matter is cast for the remolding, as it were, for its passage through the development in Earth's plane, or in the spheres to which the Earth's relations adhere in the development of a spiritual or physical body. In this we find the relations as given from those spheres in the Earth sphere. That is, as in Mercury, as in Venus, as in Mars, as in Jupiter, as in Earth, as in Uranus, as in Neptune, and the chancing, or changing, as it were, from one development to another, until the entity passes from that solar system, or sphere, through Arcturus or Septimus, as we see. As would be illustrated in this. We find in the Earth's plane that entity that manifests such hate, such aggrandizement of the laws of the flesh, in any desire made unnatural. These find their reclamation, their remolding, their beginning again, in the spheres of Saturn's relative forces. Hence again pass through those spheres in which the entity, spiritual, must manifest, that it, the entity, may manifest the gained development through the Earth's plane. For in flesh must the entity manifest and make the will one with the God or creative force in the universe, and as such development reaches that plane, wherein the development may pass into other spheres and systems, of which the Earth's solar system is only a small part. In this, then, is meant the entity must develop in that sphere, until it, the entity, has reached that stage, wherein it may manifest through the spiritual planes, as would be called from the relation to physical or fleshly plane. Explain that barrier between conscious and subconscious mind. How may we eliminate it to allow the subconscious to direct? As would best be illustrated in this. We, individuals, find in the Earth's plane those mental conditions wherein the conscious and subconscious would manifest by some given suggestion. The entity, through will, reasons with the condition. Hence the barrier is created. Again, we have as exemplified, or shown, in this. Any indiscrete condition, as regarding the mental development, that would be made as to submerge the subconscious forces, then the barrier that would bring the direct condition in the given condition. As we find when the mental forces are in that condition of submerging the conscious forces, the entity attempting to create the consciousness of the transition, creates barrier. As we would find illustrated in these conditions. As the physical body sinks into that state wherein slumber of the physical body takes hold of physical conditions, and the body becomes submerged into the earthly subconscious, the continual thought as is carried to see physical reaction, creates barrier. Now, to overcome such conditions, bring about the consciousness, the oneness of mind, soul and body, that when such submerged conditions are enacted, we find the subconscious takes the direction in the physical plane. Then such an entity is given, as spiritual-minded, subconscious-minded, subconscious-directed, spiritual-directed individuals. The more this becomes manifested, the more the entity may gain the impressions, the actual conditions of the subconscious forces, those ever directing, that gives the light and development to the soul's forces from the physical plane. From Saturn we find the influences making for that as would be a channel in the associations and activities of the entity. Nothing to the body loses its value in the experience of the entity. Hence many influences and experiences that to others would be as the ashes of disappointment or ruin are used by the entity in making for the closer union of activities. And as has been described by those who have given an illustration of the spiritual forces, the entity rather buckles on the armor of the Lord, pushing forward into those influences of the fruits of the Spirit that may be manifested in the earth. Thus it meets these in such ways and manners as to bring hope and cheer and understanding in the experiences of many, as well as developing self in such measures and manners as to make for the life experience being worthwhile throughout every disappointment, every experience, either of advancement or adversity.